Hello, everybody. Welcome to the next installment of the Literature of Sustainability series, dealing with reading, writing, and the SDGs, with a principal focus, of course, on the literary texts that enable us to find, anchored in them in various ways, the SDGs issued by the United Nations. Today, we have Professor Christine Daigle. One of the pioneering works in recent times came from her on post-humanist vulnerability. It's a delight to have somebody we have been reading for quite some time. So thank you. She's also up at a very unearthly hour, so we have to account for that as well. Thanks to all of you who have joined. Welcome, Professor Daigle, to this long-running series. We started in February, we finish end of November. Welcome on behalf of the UNESCO Chair in Vulnerability Studies. My colleague and friend, Professor Anna Kurian, will also be here, I think, and to our project assistant, that is Atul, whom you already met. For a more formal welcome, over to you, Atul.
Thank you, sir. And if I may formally introduce Professor Daigle to the audience, Christine Daigle is Professor of Philosophy and Interdisciplinary Humanities at Brock University, St. Catharines in Canada. She is the author of Post-Humanist Vulnerability, an Affirmative Ethics, published by Bloomsbury in 2023, and is preparing a monograph on the concept of joyful extinction. She is co-editor of the series Posthumanism in Practice from Bloomsbury and editor of Interconnections, a journal of posthumanism. Her research is at the intersection of posthumanist material feminist theory and environmental posthumanities. Today, her talk is titled Sharing Spaces and Thriving Together, SDG 11, a posthumanist material feminist perspective. Welcome, Professor Daigle, and over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you, Professor Naya, for the invitation to speak about Sustainable Development Goal number 11, sustainable cities and communities. I should add to my bio, which is already too extensive, I'm also part of the team for the UNESCO Chair on Sustainability here at Brock University. So I've been thinking about notions of sustainability for a while. As a reminder about that goal, the Sustainable SDG 11, as we will call it, as a reminder, the stated goal is to create inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable cities. And you can read about the details of this goal, the current facts about global urbanization and proposed ways to meet this goal on the United Nations website. Oh, I was going to move my slide, but please, if we could move to the next slide. Yes, thank you. But before addressing this specific goal, I want to take a step back and consider the language offered about the Sustainable Development Goals as a whole. The website states, and you have it here, I took it from the website, the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, remain the world's roadmap for ending poverty, protecting the planet, and tackling inequalities. The 17 SDGs offer the most practical and effective pathway to tackle the causes of violent conflict, inequalities, climate change, and environmental degradation, and aim to ensure that no one will be left behind. They reflect an understanding that sustainable development everywhere must integrate economic growth, social well-being, and environmental protection. The yellowish part is my emphasis here. And on the next slide, when you click on the button on the UNESCO's website, the button, what is sustainable development? This is what you get. You get this answer here with their own emphasis on the last sentence. Sustainable development is how we must live today if we want a better tomorrow, by meeting present needs without compromising the chances of future generations to meet their needs. The survival of our societies and our shared planet depends on a more sustainable world. When you dig further, the infographics for SDG 11 is the following. Next slide, please. Yes. You see here up to 3 billion people struggle to afford housing. 1.12 billion live in slums or informal settlements lacking basic services. Now, don't get me wrong, this is a very legitimate concern that needs to be addressed, but I think it won't be addressed properly if we do not consider the values and principles that are animating the SDGs in general, and this one in particular. And if we fail to realize that these values and principles are at the heart of the problem and how we came to the situation of polycrisis we find ourselves in. Next slide, please. Of course, nobody can really take issue with ending poverty, protecting the planet, and tackling, or even better, eliminating inequalities. These are indeed desirable, worthy goals to pursue. But I'm troubled by the underlying anthropocentrism and the implicit acceptance that economic growth is a good thing that we must pursue, as per the statement we looked at. To the first point, the underlying anthropocentrism, while there is an acknowledgement that environmental degradation and climate change are problems to tackle, they are to be addressed insofar as they affect the well-being of humans, or insofar as they affect economic growth, which we are told we must pursue. Now, of course, as humans ourselves, we are entitled to be concerned with our own well-being. There seems to be a failure to acknowledge that not only are we dependent on a thriving environment and planet, but we are deeply interconnected with the more than human. So the question that this raises is whether we value the well-being of the environment and the planet for their own sake, or for our own sake, or a mix of both. Economic growth is posited as inherently good and as something we must, that's the language, we must pursue and integrate with well-being and environmental protection. This seems to me to be very highly problematic, since it is advanced capitalism, one we may call wild capitalism, that is largely responsible for the current state of things. Indeed, since the Industrial Revolution, extractivist practices have contributed to accelerating environmental degradation, the phenomenon referred to as the Great Acceleration, with extensive impact on human and more than human populations. Advanced capitalism and its commodification of life in all of its manifestations is a large part of the problem. This is why some thinkers of the Anthropocene, the infamous human epoch, which is the epoch in which the human has left its damaging trace globally and impacted the Earth system negatively, these thinkers of the Anthropocene propose to replace Anthropocene with Capitalocene. Because if the purpose of naming this new epoch is to call out the agent that is responsible for the crisis, capitalism is a better culprit than anthropos, the human. Indeed, it is only a portion of humanity who live their lives in a certain way that are responsible for the mess. That damaging way of life is one fueled by capitalism. There are many other candidates to replace Anthropocene, but I don't want to get into this. The point here is to identify that the very formulation of the Sustainable Development Goals contains a highly problematic element, economic growth, which we are told we should pursue. I argue that we need to question and challenge whether economic growth ought to continue. In fact, what is an obstacle to social equity and the eradication of poverty is precisely an economic growth that benefits those benefits are concentrated in the hands of the very few. That is the problem. The problem is not growth, the problem is distribution. An estimate tells us that $330 billion would be needed to eradicate world hunger, while another tells us that Elon Musk's net worth is approaching $500 billion. It actually boggles the mind to think that so much wealth would be in one pair of hands only. To the question, how many billionaires should there be? My answer emphatically is zero, especially if they sit on this wealth the way they currently do. Next slide, please. While the focus on economic growth is highly problematic, it does not mean we need to abandon sustainable development goals. What is needed instead is to reconceive sustainability. Basically, we should ask ourselves, sustainability for who? And, other question, what counts as sustainable development? The whole discourse on sustainability is problematic. The standard definition, meeting the needs of the present without compromising those of future generations, posits that the needs we have are appropriate and that they should continue to be what they are. Indeed, in the context of the SDGs, those needs should be fulfilled with equity for all. But this is an impossible requirement to fulfill since those very humans who are satisfying those extravagant needs currently have exhausted resources and exacerbated environmental degradation. Of course, that's just a portion of humanity, right? Expending such fulfillment of needs or wants that have been construed as needs, or just attempting to fulfill those needs for the world population would simply lead to a complete exhaustion of resources. Other problematic phrases besides sustainable development in sustainability discourse are ecosystem services and nature solutions, which both point to the human as recipient of the care offered by sustainable practices, because of course these future generations are future generations of humans. Next slide, please. The humanist worldview that has been informing our actions and policymaking is responsible for the global state of crisis we're in. A humanist worldview considers the human to be exceptional, separate from other beings and from nature. Humanism considers the human to be in a position of dominance. The human is at the top of various versions of the great chain of beings or of the biotic pyramid, if you prefer. And this position grants the human permission to engage in extractive, exploitative, and oppressive practices. The human considers more than human beings to be resources for its sustenance. There is thus a disconnect introduced between the human and the more than human. Such view does not consider the human as interconnected. The humanist worldview is also infused with techno-optimism, the idea that since the human is a rational being with great inventivity, we will always ultimately find a techno-scientific solution to the problems we are faced with. Often the thinking goes that all we need is a little bit more work, a bit more research, a bit more creativity to devise the solution to the problems we encounter and often cause ourselves. For example, faced with an increase in demand for animal protein, the production of which puts a lot of stress on the environment, not to mention the fact that it increases the likelihood of zoonotic diseases, researchers work on technoscientific solutions like increased efficiency in factory farming or the creation of lab meat instead of focusing on changes in relations between humans and the more than humans they consume. Instead of examining our ways and questioning our relations, we seek to maintain them for ourselves and the future generations. Another example would be instead of limiting our consumption in general, we seek to green the products we consume, giving ourselves a pass for our extravagant consumption. Next slide, please. Post-humanism, literally an after-humanism, and material feminism, which is a subfield concerned with renewing attention to materiality, proposes to think things differently. It rejects human exceptionalism and anthropocentrism and repositions the human among other beings and positions the human as always interconnected with them. It posits that we need to rethink the human and dismiss the humanist conception of the human. It also points to a long history of thinking through dualisms and privileging the mind over the body, the human over the non-human, the human over nature. And this has a number of implications. The historical humanist focus on the mind, on consciousness, has entailed a disregard for materiality. Post-humanist material feminists focus our attention on materiality. Dualistic thinking has traditionally covered the manifold entanglements of which we are. We need to rediscover those and understand ourselves as entangled materially and subjectively. It is a mode of system thinking, but one in which humility is key. There is a great level of uncertainty and indeterminacy in the systems of which we are parts, and we may never fully understand them or the impact of our actions and policies with them. Post-anthropocentrism eliminates oppressive and exploitative structures of power. Rosie Braidotti speaks of Zoe egalitarianism, the valuing of all expressions of life and the recognition that life does things. Humility and Zoe egalitarianism lead us to a more careful approach, one which considers the good and flourishing of all species, a decentering of the human. Next slide, please. Posthumanist material feminism pays special attention to our material entanglements, the porosity and therefore the vulnerability of bodies, human and more than human bodies, and the vitality of matter. It posits that we depend on our material entanglements with other beings and environmental systems, and it also posits that materiality, all material objects, be they human bodies, more than human animal, or plant bodies, minerals, etc., all of these bodies are vibrant. They possess agentic capacity, and these various agentic capacities intertwine through the manifold entanglements in which we exist. Next slide. To say that agency is distributed across being is to undermine the fantasy of human mastery and exception. Attention to materiality unveils collective material agency and agentic capacity. A forest fire, like you see on the slide, has great capacity to impact beings, as does a virus like COVID-19, as we have experienced. While they are not intentional beings, they do not engage in their action as the product of a process of practical deliberation, they still have great capacity to act and impact. And we, even with our great rational powers, have little capacity to understand these unfoldings of material and agentic capacity, let alone control them in the way we would want to. This is a lesson in humility for the human. According to posthumanist material feminists, then, material entanglements make us just as much, if not more, than we make them. Next slide. With this in mind, it is important to rethink our relation to the land. After all, the land is that on which we build our cities. In Canada, where I live as a settler, we have adopted the practice of land acknowledgement. And you have here Brock University's official land acknowledgement. We acknowledge the land on which we gather. By the way, this is also the land where my house is, where I am right now. We acknowledge the land on which we gather as the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, many of whom continue to live and work here today. This territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties and is within the land protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. Today, this gathering place is home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and acknowledging reminds us that our great standard of living is directly related to the resources and friendship of Indigenous people. Now, there's lots that's problematic in the wording of this land acknowledgement. When I see friendship of Indigenous people, I keep thinking this has been very much an imposed friendship on Indigenous people, and there's lots that needs to be unpacked. But for the purposes of today, I just want to focus on the relation to land. So if we look at a revised acknowledgement on the next slide, please. Here is a revised acknowledgement that would be infused with posthumanist principles. And I want to thank a former graduate student for this formulation that he came up with. Brock University is located on the traditional territory of Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples this land is also comprised of much ecological diversity and many other than human persons, including birds, mammals, reptiles, amphibians, fish, insects, rivers, lakes, and rock formations. We acknowledge this land and history as we work toward environmental justice, decolonization, and the renewal of indigenous sovereignty. You see, there's a very different emphasis in both wordings of a land acknowledgement. Next slide, please. In a 2024 article titled The Land in Us, Rick Dolphin offers his take on land and the notion of the commune or community building from Marx and Serre. He says, you have the quote here, "In modernity, we have become alienated from the soil that breeds us, from the communities to which we belong, and from ourselves." He continues in the article and he says, quote, "Taken out of our community, the plant, the animal, and the human have grown stupid, are made to follow orders, and do not have the power to give form to their life otherwise," end quote. And he concludes his article by saying, "Living in times of ecological crisis, it is deeply worrying to witness the forgetting of the land by people and machines jointly. What does this mean for the realization of the common, for living together?" he asks. This question, I think, is a fundamental question, and it pertains directly to SDG 11. What kind of connection to the land and to nature do we have? And have we lost sight of how to build our communities, our spaces, how we're living together? I think we have. Next slide, please. According to the United Nations, more than 50% of the world's population currently lives in urban areas, with a projected increase to almost 70% by 2050. While urban living may differ significantly between a megalopolis like Tokyo or Mumbai and a small-sized city like Thorold, where I live, with 20,000 other human inhabitants, it remains that for urban dwellers, keeping in touch with nature and the land can be challenging. In the Niagara region, where Thorold is located, we are fortunate to always be somewhat close to the countryside with easy access to trails, fields, orchards, and vineyards. And two of the Great Lakes, Lake Ontario and Lake Erie, sort of sandwich the Niagara region. The canal with the big ships that go from one big lake to the other is just 1 block away from my house. I see them from my house. So this is where I am located, and we have access to these natural elements, the countryside, nature, the land. Although maybe it is debatable how natural these sites are, given that there is a lot of human management of land that goes into their upkeep. In smaller cities, like the one I live in, those who own or rent a house sometimes have access to a yard that they can use to engage in vegetable and fruit gardening. Other small city dwellers, however, may not have this kind of access, and their contact with nature may be limited to the plants and flowers they keep in balcony planters, or to the city parks they visit in order to enjoy some grass, trees, and birds. Also squirrels, lots of squirrels. Inhabitants of large cities and megalopoli or polises, I'm not too sure how to pronounce this. These inhabitants may not have access to any natural spaces at all, other than city parks, if and when they exist. Some individuals never go out of their cities, whether for lack of interest, lack of financial means, or both. And their only experience with nature is through manicured city-managed areas, such as parks. To remedy this, regreening has become an urban strategy of restoring degraded or barren landscapes to a more naturalized state using trees, shrubs, and wildflowers. However, and despite many cities' efforts to re-green themselves, not everyone considers green spaces to be important for their citizens, thereby limiting access to nature for a great number of city dwellers. Also, some cities have been built in such a way that it makes it almost impossible to create these green spaces. So for those people, the only access might be through the scruffy trees growing through sidewalk concrete. They may also have a mediated access to nature in the form of nature shows that they would watch on television or on YouTube, in which nature is presented as pristine and distant, or newscasts that speak of nature mainly when some catastrophic event is unfolding, such as a hurricane, a volcanic eruption, floods, etc., thereby portraying nature as dangerous and threatening. If the connection to nature is very tenuous or inexistent for many urban dwellers, how are the calls for the need to care for nature and adopt more sustainable ways expected to be heard? An expression coined by Latin poet Sextus Propertius captures this well. He says, "Far from sight, far from heart. It is difficult to care for beings one has no contact with. Calls for saving the oceans and their inhabitants will not be heard by the person whose only contact with them is via the can of tuna they consume or the goldfish they once had as a child." Likewise, environmentalists' pleas to save remote or even unknown species from extinction due to hunting, overharvesting, urban expansion, pollution, or the introduction of invasive species in some areas are unlikely to be heard by those with little or no contact with nature. If our goal is to coexist on the planet with other species while not driving them to extinction, leaving behind a world that future generations can enjoy, the standard definition of sustainability, then we need to better understand why this is such a pressing issue. Reconnecting with nature, experiencing it directly, and exposing ourselves to its beauty, its generosity, as well as its annoyances, such as the bugs that may want to feed from us as we enjoy a stroll in a provincial park. It is key. All of this is key to understanding the need to change our exploitative approach to nature. To do so, we need to individually and collectively make efforts to reconnect to nature so that we may develop a better understanding of it, its inner workings, our place in it, and how to care for it. It is hard to wrap our head around the fact that we are always part of multiple ecologies of belonging if we never encounter nature and the more than human. What if we shared spaces, including urban spaces, with more than human creatures? Next slide, please. Reconceptualizing the human, the non-human, and the world should have an impact on concrete daily actions and how we plan things. If the world we inherit is a human world, that is, a world that has been shaped by a humanist worldview, then how will we design the world of tomorrow? If recent history teaches us anything, it means we will continue to engage in wild urbanization, urban sprawl, ghettoization, and limiting access to open public spaces. As per the UNESCO SDG 11 webpage, they say, again, approximately 1.1 billion people currently live in slums or slum-like conditions in cities, with 2 billion more expected in the next 30 years. We saw that earlier. Pollution, inequities, poverty, and access to proper housing and infrastructures are all issues that come along with current modes of urbanization. We need, however, to engage in sustainable urban planning to avoid or limit these issues. But what does it mean to engage in post-humanist sustainable urban planning? It means considering how we design our cities and control our sprawl to be respectful of the thriving of the more than human with whom we share multiple ecologies of belonging. This means sharing spaces with them. If we are humble about our agency and acknowledge our entanglements with other agentic capacities, how will we approach such things as neighborhood designs and yard managements? And the examples I will offer now may not be possible in all urban settings because I take them from my own lived experience in the small Ontario city of Thorold, but they offer an insight into how we can adopt different perspectives with different results. Next slide, please. So these are images of the what I like to call the Thorold Forest, which is my backyard. It is a pretty wild backyard. It has a lot of trees, a lot of weeds, a lot of native plants and whatnot. And it is also the home of many beings. In this yard, you find raccoons, possums, rabbits, squirrels, chipmunks, mice, and so many birds, doves, sparrows, blue jays, cardinals, juncos, chickadees, woodpeckers, even auks. One morning, I went to my kitchen to make tea, and there was a big auk sitting on my back deck banister the one morning, and he was just looking at me, very unimpressed by my human presence. He looked so snobby, it was quite amusing, but he was big. So there's lots of life in this wild backyard of mine. Next slide, please. The liveliest presence, though, has been that of raccoons. You see them here. They are playing on my back deck. And for years, they have nested under my back deck. They would come out during the day and play on the banister, and they would climb the tree and go on the roof of the deck. And they were all very near me because in the summer, I do work at my patio table. And this is why they were used to my quiet presence, because I was literally sitting and working on top of them. They were under the deck. And Mama Raccoon, who had chosen that spot for giving birth and raising the kids, seemed to trust me enough to let them play near me and approach me with curiosity. And they are very curious. The one evening, one was right between my legs as I was watching a movie on my computer. So I had to, shoo a kid gently, because you don't want to get too close either. Next slide, please. The one day, there's a little hole by the chimney that you see there, and there's a vine that grows through it. And I could see the vine moving, and so I started playing with the kit that was under. And I don't know if you can play the clip, but you will see the snout of the little bugger if you can play it. Yes.
Salut.
So we had a little game that day where the kid was showing the tip of his snout and looking at me, and we were just like, he was pulling, I was pulling. Yes, so it's a lot of fun interactions with the raccoons at my house, and also with the birds. And I've written about those interactions in my book, Posthumanist Vulnerability. Next slide, please. Yes, so we can also consider, so my choice in my yard has been to interact respectfully and with humility with the critters that share the space with me. But you can also consider different choices that landowners, I put quotation marks because I question the notion of owning the land, different choices that landowners can make with regards to plants and trees. So what you see on the left are pictures of the house next to me. They're right there. It's a bed and breakfast, and it's a manicured yard, front yard and backyard, with a pool. And they also control or try to control the squirrel population, capturing them and relocating them while living next to my forest, which is on the right. And where all kinds of different plants grow and do their thing, right? So this is a different kind of approach. And in North America, the perfect grass in the front and the perfectly landscaped front yard in particular is very important to people. Mine is what it is. So I'm not trying to achieve control over what is happening naturally. I do have to a certain extent, but not not to the point where you reach aesthetic perfection. You have to question, though, which approach is more sustainable and for whom. Next slide, please. Now, when we think about urban development in Canada, in particular, we have an affordability crisis for access to housing, and the housing market is quite feverish. Many are claiming that more housing needs to be built in order to satisfy the increasing demand. Which again, it's a thing I question, because there's many older houses like mine. My house is 150 years old next year, and there are many old houses that have vacant space, but there is a perceived need for new housing. This demand, the increasing demand for housing, means that there will be increased urban expansion. And that means the conversion of land into brand new neighborhoods filled with cookie cutter houses. Some developments contain monster houses, what we call monster houses, single family houses with more than 200 square meters of habitable space, and sometimes much more than 200 square meters, and with garages for 2 to 3 cars, sometimes 4. You see that in those neighborhoods. And to compare, my 150 years old house is 139 square meters and was built for a family with numerous children. As a person by myself in this house, it's way too big for me. Who needs that much space, right? In the new developments, I think calling them neighborhoods feels wrong. In these developments, young trees will be planted here and there to grow through sidewalks. Conversely, sidewalks may sometimes be non-existent in certain areas that are poorly serviced by public transit. And these areas will be designed with the assumption that residents will use cars, hence the 2 or 3 car garage. Residents will use cars to commute, and there will be little thought given to the walkability of the area. Urban developers who design those neighborhoods, quotation marks, may also plan for a green space or playground, especially when the area is meant to be family oriented. Yards will be covered with roll-out grass to create instant lawns, with empty spaces left for the first dwellers to garden as they wish or not. Plants that were naturally growing in these areas in harmonious relation with the animals and bugs and birds of the surrounding ecosystem. These plants are now considered weeds, and weeds need to be controlled and eliminated. What was once a natural habitat with a variety of animal and plant species that all shared an ecosystem will be destroyed. In its place will be a space designed by humans and for humans, with the goal of eliminating as many natural annoyances as possible. Land clearing makes space for humans, while simultaneously eliminating entire ecosystems in the process. Furthermore, it brings humans and wildlife closer together, often with negative implications. Increased urban sprawl in Thorold, which is a small city, as I said, 20,000 people only. We still are facing urban sprawl, and it has generated a surge of coyote encounters and even attacks. 2 winters ago, there was a pack of coyotes that was roaming my street at night, and I was woken up a few times in the middle of the night with their yipping and howling. The one night, I thought they were right below my window because it was that loud. I don't blame them for getting so close, and I especially don't blame them for coming to my yard because it is a good hunting spot for them, being that it's a small forest. And I am on the city's fringe. I am near a wooded area, and so they do come into the area, which they didn't used to, because they are being kicked out of their natural ecosystems. Closer proximity between animals and humans can lead to fun interactions, as I've described earlier, but it can also increase incidences of zoonotic diseases such as bird flu or rabies. And the one day I went to the trail for a run, and there was a fox laying in a semi-urban area by the trail, laying there in the open, visibly sick. And I had to call the Lincoln Society for Welfare for Animal because that animal was clearly not well, and also didn't belong to that area. So that just tells you that there is more and more encroachment because they are being pushed out of their own ecosystems. While there has been a lot of work done in relation to sustainable urban development, it often focuses on mitigating the impact of climate change by planning for human movement that is not car dependent, through the development of more efficient public transit, cycling, and walking paths, which is not always on the mind of urban developers, as I said. But more should also be done to work with established ecosystems instead of clearing and destroying them. The United Nations Environment Program, UNEP, report titled Integrating the Environment in Urban Planning and Management, Key Principles and Approaches for Cities in the 21st Century. That report, for example, proposes a series of planning principles for integrated and sustainable urban development. This includes committing to an environmental ethic and the regeneration of natural systems in order to make cities green. But I ask, can we avoid having to regenerate by working to achieve a better integration to start with, one that does not destroy these ecosystems? Do we have to bulldoze areas, fill marshes, cut trees to build houses, and then plant new trees? Next slide, please. So one sad example of urban design gone wrong in that regard was the revitalization project in downtown Thorold. And I should say downtown is a big word for what is really a 2-block stretch of our main street. In recent years, a great deal of effort has gone into giving Thorold's Front Street a facelift to attract new visitors, new diners, and new shoppers. Facades of buildings on the downtown street were redone, and as part of its recent push for revitalization in 2020, the city redid the sidewalks. And they added parking spaces and the integrated benches, new light standards, and other streetscaping elements. Instead of implementing a design that kept the mature, established trees that you see on the image on the left and the top center image, nice mature trees. So instead of implementing a design that would have kept those mature, established trees, the city opted to cut those trees down in order to facilitate new sidewalks. New, very young trees were planted in their stead. So you see that on the picture on the right. While the change in landscape is indeed shocking, there is more than mere aesthetic enjoyment at stake here. Comparing the old to the new, the pre-revitalization to the revitalized downtown core, one might notice that nature has been almost completely evacuated. The little new trees that were recently planted have been given only a small space in the ground to expand their trunks. This will lead to the necessity of eventually cutting them down in the future, a necessity created entirely by humans' lack of planning for the tree's needs. Beyond the drastic change in canopy, one needs to also think of how the changes impact the many creatures that were living in or relied on the mature trees for survival. Cutting mature trees down to satisfy the human desire for revitalization destroyed the habitat of creatures that were forced to relocate. Revitalizing the downtown core was not done with a view of the ecosystem that it was, and in fact amounted to a devitalization, where mature tree dwellers, such as birds, squirrels, and bugs, had to leave the downtown core, making it less lively. Those little trees are still very small 5 years later and still cannot host a bird's nest, or let alone a squirrel's nest, which is much bigger. So those critters, those mature tree dwellers, had to move to other areas. If planners had considered the impact on nature and ecosystems, they would and they could have done things differently. Making cities green and environmentally friendly by planning urban development with post-humanist sustainability principles that consider both human and more than human members of the community and their well-being is possible. It is also possible to respect and work with the integrity of ecosystems. It can and it should be at the forefront of our thinking as we continue building more space for human use, since the growth of world population is giving no sign of slowing or going down. Next slide, please. Architects and urban designers have been thinking about ways to build while integrating with our environments, although this is not always put in application, as I said. Another way to dwell on the land and build our cities and communities is possible. Greening city centers, rooftop gardening or wilding, biohouses, even hobbit houses. These are all ways in which we can improve our participation in the multiple ecologies of belonging that we are interconnected with. Being mindful of our interconnectedness, being humble, being respectful, and careful. I insist on full here. Be full of care, really, for being humble, respectful, and careful for the more than human, as much as we are for the human, is the key to successful sustainable development. In fact, it is the only sustainable way to develop, including for our cities and communities. What if we were to build to integrate with our environments rather than against it? Could we live in hobbit houses, biohouses? Can we green city centers, engage in rooftop gardening and such practices? Can we invite the more than human and share spaces with them for all of us to thrive? Should we not care about all future generations, not just the human? I think we can. And engaging in a critical examination of the principles at the root of our sustainability action is the key. Thank you. I have a final slide, but thank you. Yes.
Thanks a lot, Professor Daigle. We'll now have questions and comments from the audience. Roy has a question. Please go ahead, Roy.
Thank you, Professor Daigle. I mean, it was an enlightening presentation and it opened up several points of interest. One thing that caught my attention particularly was how you mentioned that city dwellers, they have to depend on, let's say, channels like National Geographic to actually learn something about wildlife because they are so separate from it themselves. And one thing I've noted is, how we get certain things wrong about non-human life, specifically these channels themselves. So one example, since we are talking post-human feminism, one example I wanted to point out was the representation of a symbiosis between the Nile crocodile and a small bird called the water thickney. So they lay their eggs together on land, and the bird acts as a kind of sentry or security guard for the eggs. Because there's this thing called the Nile monitor lizard that tries to steal the eggs. So if the lizard turns up, the bird causes a commotion and the crocodile comes to the rescue. So this symbiosis is presented by nature channels as strange or unusual. I think to get more viewership, I suppose, because they're presenting it as two very unlikely female animals coming together. But the actual fact is that birds and crocodiles are more related than crocodiles and other reptiles because they derive from a common lineage called the archosaurs, and which includes the dinosaurs. So, and both these species have been around for long before humans. So, if anything, we are the strange ones. But the way we look at symbiosis in general is it's like something out of the ordinary, and the ordinary being these artificial urban spaces, like you mentioned, the spaces that we create. And another thing is, even though the symbiosis isn't perfect, like both partners have they stand to lose. Sometimes the crocodile inadvertently breaks the eggs because it's so large, and the bird also sometimes, the lizard outsmarts the bird and gets away with the eggs. Even then, the symbiosis helps both the species grow. So it's like, I mean, it is not only is it not strange, it's also something that most humans fail to do, work together in a sustainable way. So I feel like, these misrepresentations are partly because of our own distance from nature. We have to depend on somebody's wisdom, which can be as flawed as ours. So that's what I have to say, Professor. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for this this comment. I agree. I agree fully with what you said, and what you were discussing here. The example you gave made me think of my. I have a little theory. I think there's a lot of collaboration going on in my yard among the birds and the squirrels in particular, because the birds have learned to signal that they want me to give them seeds. And so sometimes the cardinal will come and ask for seeds. I'll go out and put seeds because I oblige. And the cardinal will pick one or two seeds, and 2 minutes later, a squirrel shows up to eat all the seeds. So I think there's collaboration here in terms of, because a squirrel might beg for seeds, but I may not oblige as much as I do for a cardinal. So they've understood. And it's a matter of helping each other. But I mean, that's a silly example, but that's one I see very often. But there are multiple examples in nature among more than humans of collaborations and symbiotic relations. And we have, through a humanist worldview, we have separated ourselves from that. We have thought of ourselves as non-natural beings, and we have decided to ignore or consider as strange those relations, as you say, right? And of course, doing so has led to all the problems we are faced with now, I think. So shifting our perspective is fundamental to a sustainable approach, yes.
Are there any more questions, comments, responses to Professor Daigle's lecture?
Thank you so much, ma'am, for such an enlightening session. I do agree that there is a sort of interconnectedness between human and inanimate world. But however, I also believe that there is a need that we bring down ground level changes. Like there is a need that we bring policy reforms because I am from India, every now and then we get an order to take stray dogs away from the streets and put them into shelter. So I believe at a human level we can create a difference, but in order to create difference at a mass level, we need some reforms, and that is why we have SDGs. But what about implementation? That is another challenge. How many of these SDGs are being implemented in our areas? So that is something, is the root cause, I believe, and that needs to be actually worked upon. Because we have a tendency to put human beings at a pedestal, right? So every now and then we bring a reform that only puts us more into to the pedestal, and even if we do not want, implicitly we do disrespect other creatures in one way or the other. So this is something I just wanted to share.
Mhm.
uh,
Yes, thank you. I think you raise a really important point because I think it's a bit of a balancing act. We do need to get down from that pedestal. That is essential. Um, at the same time, that doesn't mean not looking after our own well-being and survival. And so I've painted a rosy portrait of my relation with critters and whatnot. But the one day 2 years ago, I had a rat in my basement, and the rat was eating some of the food I had in the basement. Rats also carry diseases. And so, as much as I disliked having to have a pest control person come in, because I knew what the fate of the rat would be, I did have to look after that, and I did, right? Because this is a matter of my own health safety and the integrity of the building, because rats will be quite destructive, right? So what kind of intervention, and is it an intervention? I said, okay, we need to get that rat that is inside the house. If they're in the yard, you do your thing, right?
Correct.
And so but I thought about that relation. My neighbors, which I like, by the way, they're nice people, but they have a very different approach. They do not tolerate any raccoon, any squirrel, anybody, even if they're just outside. And it's like, but outside, who said that this belongs to who, right? And the raccoons in my yard are manageable. In the city of Toronto, there's lots of memes and videos on TikTok. They are incredibly disruptive and destructive. They will chew on wires and destroy structures. So it's not always a kind of a Walt Disney kind of relation. It can be difficult, and sometimes there will be a need for action. If you need if there's an overpopulation of dogs or cats, and there's a need to neuter them, right? But see, this is where you think of the nature of the intervention. Are we taking them off the streets to neuter them so that they don't increase the population, or are we taking them off the street to euthanize them? See, this is where there's some thinking needs to go into that, because of course you cannot have a city with an overpopulation. It creates other issues, right? And so it will not always be easy, but what I see often is a lack of reflection, and a reflection that is entirely oriented toward the well-being of the human. But I think our well-being depends on the well-being of all these other creatures. Yeah. Another silly example, and of course, this may not be an issue at all in India, but in Canada here, we have the 4 seasons. Right now it's fall, so the trees are losing their leaves, and the yards are covered with dead leaves. But it's good to leave the dead leaves on the grass because it offers
Right.
protection for pollinators and whatnot. But people are obsessed with cleaning their yards and picking up the leaves. And it's like, why would that be something you value when in fact you depend on pollinators for the food you eat? There's a lack of understanding of all of these interconnections, and the kind of interventions we make are guided by these misunderstandings and misconceptions. And so this is why I started my talk with looking at the language itself of the SDGs and say, okay, there's a number of things we assume here, but we don't question those things. We need to do that. We need to question those values and principles that we think are good, right? Yeah, but thank you.
Thank you.
If there are no more questions or comments, conclude today's session. And to conclude, we'll have Roy Matthew, one of our most regular participants, with the formal vote of thanks. Roy, please go ahead.
Thank you, Atul. First of all, thanks to the speaker, esteemed Professor Christine Daigle, for being up at around 8:30 in the morning, I suppose, to enlighten us with her amazing lecture, and for the insights she shared about her place of the place where she lives and the history, both human and otherwise, associated with it. Thanks to Professor Pramod K. Nair, UNESCO Chair of Vulnerability Studies, for convening the meeting, and to Professor Anna Kurian, Faculty Fellow to the UNESCO Chair. Thanks to Atul for his diligent presence and for being there whenever anything goes wrong. And thanks to Mabel Susan, who designed the attractive poster for the event. And last but not least, thanks to all the participants who are here on a Friday evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Daigle, and all our participants.
Thank you. Thank you.
I hope it's not a very disruptive day for you, given the unearthly hours you woke up.
Well, it's all right. I'll take a nap later. It's 8:30 now, so usually that's the start of my day.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.